We are delighted to be here to present the findings of our research project on resource provision in mainstream schools for students with disabilities. And this is one of the main events that we are disseminating our findings. And for this reason, we have invited the participants of the research project. So hopefully they are here with us. We have also extended the invitation to the local authority and to local schools. And also to our network on inclusive education, the European Network in Inclusive Education. Very quickly, what we're planning to do in the next 40 minutes, Becky will describe what is resource provision here in England and the policy around it. She will also talk about prior research in this area. And then I will describe how we generated data with the 3 schools and what are the theoretical and the practical implications for school staff, parents, and students. And of course, then we will have time for questions and answers. Becky, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really good to be with you all. So to give you an introduction into the sort of policy guidelines around resource provisions and what they are, we have displayed this little tile that tells you that the government actually produce guidelines that schools need to follow. And resource provisions are quite a specific type of provision. Children are enrolled in a resource provision in a mainstream school. And this is the policy for England because education policy has devolved in the UK. Resource provisions are for children with an EHCP, an Education, Health and Care Plan, or with a specific type of special educational need. And they require a base and facilities within the mainstream school that are particularly used for the children enrolled in the resource provision. There is additional funding, so that is given to the school, it goes with the child and is used to provide specialist provision. There are additional facilities within the school in the terms of the staff or the equipment or the space in the school. The children, and this is important, the children spend most of their time in the mainstream school and have extra support rather than what have been termed designated units or different terms which we'll explore later, where a child is in a separate classroom for the whole time. In a resource provision, they spend most of their time in the mainstream school. And it is, as I said, for children with an EHCP or with a special educational need. So just to give you a picture of the sort of numbers we're talking about, there's been an upward trend for a while for children getting an EHCP and for children with special educational needs. So if you look at the figures here from 2021 to 2022, children with EHCPs has risen from 3.7% to 4%, and it's been a continual increase. But children with special educational needs have actually increased more, so from 8.3% to 12.6%. So there's quite a large number of children within mainstream schools who do require some extra support. And just to give you a little bit of extra information, for the EHCPs, the majority of children are autistic, and for special educational need, the majority of children have a speech and language or communication difficulty, but that's not limited to those children. So there are resource provision children who might have a visual impairment or some other kind of special educational need. In terms of schools with resource provision classrooms in England, so bearing in mind there's over 32,000 schools in England, in 2021, there were 1,066 resource provision classrooms, and that had gone up from just over 1,000 the year before. And in 2022, there's 1,125. So again, year on year, more schools are able to provide a resource provision classroom. So what do we know about resource provisions that's particularly important? The first thing is that children are enrolled in the resource provision classroom in the mainstream school. So that is where their base is, that's where they're really looked after. And when you're looking through the literature and when you're finding out what other people have done, it's important to understand that around the world, different terms are used. So things like resource classrooms or special classes, terms like that are used. But there are also different types of provision. So self-contained classrooms or inclusive classrooms actually describe something a little bit different. So they're usually where children stay in one classroom that is a special education provision for their whole time in school. So they're not really being included in the whole mainstream. So as you're reading the literature, the things to really look out for if you're confused by the various terms, and people do use them interchangeably, it's where is the child enrolled? Are they enrolled in the resource provision or in the classroom within a mainstream school? And how much time do they spend within the mainstream classrooms? And how much time are they actually being included in the mainstream school? So that's just something to watch out for. I'm just going to give a little bit of background on the prior research. So we're going to start off with staff. What do we know about staff views on resource provisions? So there are a few studies, we've picked out a few of them, where researchers were exploring the perceptions of staff towards resource provision classrooms. And there are a couple of studies looking at 5 mainstream schools and particularly provision for autistic students. Staff were really pleased that there was complementary roles between the different staff in the resource provision and the mainstream, and they were able to work together. So it broadened out the support they're able to give children. They found that there was really useful input from external professionals, so they had those relationships and links with other people and could bring in expertise. It actually had a positive influence on the whole school. So more and more mainstream classroom teachers were starting to use things like visual timetables or extra supports that help the transition for the children from resource provisions, but actually help children in the whole class. But there were concerns for communication between staff, between the different classrooms, making sure everybody knew up-to-date information, excuse me, and were able to share up-to-date news about the child or the family. In terms of parents, there are a few studies that looked at parents' perceptions and compared parents of children in a mainstream school only and children in a mainstream school with a resource provision. So one of the big things that parents were pleased about with the resource provision was that children were able to make friends in different places around the school. So they weren't just in a very small group with those children, they were able to make wider friendships. There were good and bad things about communication across the school, so they sometimes felt their mainstream teacher didn't understand a situation that the resource provision did, but there were some good news. There were some good ideas about communication. There were problems with the local education authority that parents couldn't always get advice or places in the setting that they thought was best for their child, and the process was very complicated. Schools weren't always able to support parents with that. But they did feel that the mainstream school had better awareness of their child's needs than a school that didn't have a resource provision. So the school was able to share that knowledge and that news. And what about the children? What did the children think? Well, the children were very positive. Overall, they loved having a resource provision. And one of the biggest things that was really important for them was having these friendships in different spaces. The paper cited at the bottom there, Warren, actually used a visual storyboard methodology to help children be able to communicate their feelings and their thoughts. And the children were really positive. It was excellent. Just on a policy initiative as well, the EEF in 2020 put out this report, and their best evidence said that to be able to provide really great support for children, and that resource provisions could provide, was specialist small group and one-to-one interventions for children. And that's what resource provisions are able to do. They're able to give that extra support that helps a child then engage in the mainstream classes.
So now we move to our research project, and our basic aims were to describe and evaluate with the participants, with the 3 schools, the effective practices, as well as those that they were finding challenging in educating the students in these 2 different settings, in the resource provision and the mainstream classrooms. And we developed 3 research questions The first one was how is resource provision conceptualized and implemented in the 3 schools. The second one, how the participants understand and experience the benefits as well as the obstacles in the education of these students. And the third one, which corresponds to the transformative element of the study, which I will tell you more about this in a while. It was to identify those initiatives that are emerging in response to the challenges. So what can we do to transform our practice and make it better? In addition to this, another main aim was to co-create with the 3 schools a guiding document in which we wanted to describe effective practices, examples of these practices and case studies. And we are now developing it with the 3 schools. And the idea is for this to work as a toolkit in which other schools can use. And for this reason, I'm now in collaboration with the local authority to see how we can expand it to other schools as a tool that can help them to think about and improve their practice. The overall methodology that we followed to generate data with the participants was critical communicative methodology, CCM. One of the main principles is that the researchers and the research participants are equal partners. And based on an egalitarian dialogue and communication, they try to understand the participant situations and ways to transform it. And the main tool to do this is by bringing academic knowledge. So the participants are bringing research findings to the dialogue, and the participants their own practical knowledge. And based on this, as I said before, they try to understand and think how they can improve, how they can transform their own reality. And I will give a practical example of this in a while. So in our search for schools, we looked very carefully at the websites of many schools in 1-2 local education authorities. And we decided to send an email to those schools that we thought that they had an inclusive language in their website, that there were links between the resource provision and the mainstream classroom for the students. So the students from the resource provision were also educated in the mainstream classrooms. And also to have consistency in the sample, we selected only primary schools and those that they were educating students with learning disabilities, because we might have resource provision for students with visual impairments or units for those with hearing loss and so on. In this email, we made it very clear that we are not coming to your schools as experts. We are coming to discuss with you, to think together, to co-understand, and then decide what you want to improve, if you want to improve something. So it was a win-win situation. 3 schools accepted our invitation, 2 infant schools and 1 junior school. I will name them School A, School B, and School C. Apparently, they all had a resource provision classroom. School A, the label, let's say, for the resource provision was speech, language, and for students with speech, language, and communication difficulties, but also with other underlying needs. School 2 was for moderate learning difficulties, and School C for those with severe and complex difficulties. And in each school, the participants we included was the resource provision manager, 1 of the mainstream teachers, learning support assistants from the resource provision, also 1 child and their mothers. And the child and the mainstream teacher was the one that was accommodating the child in their class. So they knew the child, everybody knew the children we have selected. The process and the research tools that we used to generate data, we implemented the study in 6 steps. Initially, we had individual conversations, reflective conversations with resource provision managers and parents. And the idea was to understand how they were working, how resource provision was implemented in their school. And what we did is we analyzed this data in step 2, and it was then when we decided what kind of academic knowledge we will bring to the discussion, which would happen in 3 communicative focus groups. That was the next step. And to give you an example of what we did, I went with a set of slides, but I didn't teach the slides, but it was like a document that we all had in front of us and we could refer to. And for example, at the right side, you can see what research findings there were already for parents, what were parents' views about the resource provision. And in the left-hand side is a policy document that was giving guidance about the resource provision. So we brought all this into the discussion, and the good part of it was that it was a context that it enhanced the dialogue. We had something to talk about, to relate, to think about similarities, to think about differences. So that really increased the dialogue, and I believe it improved it. The next step was that, and Becky will tell you more about this, that we observed each child for 2 days in each school. Becky, do you want to tell us about the observations?
Yeah, so as Vasilis was saying, what we wanted to do was to understand the participants' experiences of the resource provisions and the schools. And with the children, we wanted to enable them to communicate their views. They weren't all similar in the way that they like to communicate. So what we did was, I went in and spent 2 days in each school with the children. I spent time with them alone or with other staff members in different spaces. And that was really to get to know the children, to get to know how they communicated, so that we could actually invite them to share their school experience, how they understood their school experience, and how they think it could be transformed. So just to give you an example, for one of them, the child really loved drawing pictures. And when he drew a picture, he was then able to explain who the picture was of, or why that person was important, or what difference it made in the school. And also to take photos to show the spaces or the places or the activities that he really enjoyed in school. And then we were able to talk about that. So that rather blurry picture is because he was high speed at taking photos, and we sort of ran around the school. But he was able to show the spaces and places that he loved being in, and then we could talk about the places or spaces that were more difficult for him. So having done the observations and having spoken with the children in their different ways, we were able to get their views and the ways that they would like things to be changed.
Thank you. And then what we did is we analyzed again, and we did some preliminary analysis for all the data in the previous steps, and we put together those practices that the school had said are effective and those that are challenging, and it had the form of something like that, in which we divided in themes and sub-themes. So, for example, we discussed, I will talk about this in the findings in a while, what's happening in the mainstream classroom. And for example, in 2G, expand the work children do in resource provision class to mainstream spaces. So that was one of the challenges, let's say, that we brought into the discussion to think how we can improve. Something similar for students' friendships, how we can improve their friendships in the school. And based on that, we had another set of focus groups in the 3 schools. And the discussion continues, as I told you. So now we are developing this guiding document into a toolkit. But I also returned the findings to the mothers. I had another set of meetings with them in which we discussed about their own concerns, the similarities among the 3 schools, the differences, so what they can do to improve their collaboration with the school. As I've told you before, it was a win-win situation for the participants, so it was very important for them to think how to improve their practice, and not just for us to collect data. Our main findings, it was clear from the beginning that there were two main models in delivering resource provision among the three schools. That's why I have divided the findings in two case studies. School A, and it's one case, School B and C, and another case. So, and we gave these names with the participants, resource provision as a service and resource provision as a space. So what they were doing in the resource provision as a service, the children from the resource provision, they were spending most of their time in the mainstream classes. And the staff from the resource provision was providing their service to the teachers of the mainstream classes and to the children, but not all of the time. They were not in there all of the time, but some hours per week they were taking the children back to the resource provision for individual and small group teaching. In schools B and C, the resource provision was more as a space. So there was a separate class in which the children were spending most of the time and then a few hours per week in the mainstream classrooms. And I have some quotations here. I asked the schools to tell me why they have decided this way of working. So in School A, I have a quotation here from one of the from the resource provision manager, and basically she says that we believe that if we have the children in the mainstream classroom, they learn better. And they gave an example of what mom had told her. She said, we've got an example from John. John is the child that had as a case study this week. I don't know if mom told you this, but she said he was making a sandwich and she thought she heard him saying, "Shall I cut it into quarters?" If we had been teaching him in a resource provision class, we wouldn't have got as far as teaching quarters. So it's this immersion with the other children. We feel that they catch more learning than we might otherwise have given them credit to have potential for. So we believe that they learn better in the mainstream classroom. In schools B and C, there was the notion of successful inclusion. So we include the children in the mainstream classroom only if we feel that the requirements are in place and that the inclusion would be successful. And we were talking a lot about the students' needs and how they can be included if it is of benefit for them. And a learning support assistant gave an example. We've got a very autistic little girl who would never cope with going, making the change. Even though she's very good at a lot of her subjects, just that environment, it's too overwhelming. With all of the other children, is out of your comfort zone completely and she'd never go. It's not of benefit. So it was based on children's needs and the successful inclusion as the main idea. I will talk more about this in a while. We then discussed how, if there is any co-planning, how they co-plan before the children move to the mainstream classroom, or what's the planning for them when they are in there. So in School A, it was clear that the mainstream teachers were responsible for all children's planning, including those from the resource provision, but the job of the resource provision staff was to provide the adaptations, was to modify the curriculum for them to access the content and the rest of the learning. As one mainstream teacher said, I've got a learning objective for my lesson, and for John, I need to go up several stages back. And this is where Jan, the learning support assistant from resource provision, can help sometimes to differentiate the content. In School C, B and C, we discussed a lot about how they prepare the children to go to the mainstream classroom and the notion of successful transitions. So they were using social stories, visual cues, they were informing the children what's going to happen in the mainstream classroom, who they're going to talk with. So it had to be, a successful activity for them. Then we discussed what are they doing in the mainstream classroom, how the staff works, what the children are doing. So the practices were very similar in the three schools, and they described many effective practices. For example, that the learning support assistants were not sitting all the time on one-to-one with the children, so they were not masking their difficulties. We discussed how they participate in whole class activities, in small group activities, and also it was very important that they stated in the three schools that the mainstream teacher said we are learning from when we are observing what the staff from the resource provision are doing for the students. So then when they are not in the class, we can continue this work. And there's a very nice example of a mainstream teacher. She said, yesterday in computing, they had to program something on the iPad. Obviously, John can't do that, but there was a boy sitting with him going, look, we have to do this. And he showed him to try with finger, this bit to this bit. And John did that. And I just feel very proud of that. So that was a successful example of peer-mediated learning. But of course, there were also challenges. In another school, the resource provision manager said that I sent them in science year 6, and it was great because it was practical, they could access the learning. But then in the previous hour, they had to produce a written text. It wasn't accessible for them. And saying that, she also found a solution. She said, so it's more just, can it be done in a way that they can access it? So I think that they can access the learning, but it's how maybe the mainstream teachers present this learning. So they need to do more adjustments, more differentiation. Also, there were differences between School A and School B and C in what they were doing in the resource provision class. In School A, the aim was to have complementary targets between the two settings. So when they were doing something in the resource provision class, then the idea was to see this, the children to generalize this in the mainstream classroom. Whereas in schools BSc, we talked about how different the content, the curriculum can be, and what we can do to align it between the resource provision and the mainstream classrooms. A big part of the conversation, as you can imagine, was about parents. And there were many similarities and one big difference. In School A, the parents had very good contact with the mainstream teachers, whereas in School B and C, not so much contact with the mainstream teachers because, as I've told you, they were spending most of their time in the resource provision class. So during the focus groups, we discussed about this. Actually, they realized this in School B and C, and they started thinking how we can change that. But the similarities across the three schools were that overall parents were very satisfied, as we have seen before in other studies, but at the same time they were very concerned. They thought that the concern was about have I taken the right decision to enroll my child in a space that is between a mainstream and a special. So if you think that a resource provision class is not entirely in a mainstream, is not in a special, is somewhere in between. So that was a dilemma. And also, will my child close the gap between him, her, and the mainstream children? And there are some quotations that vividly describe that. A mom says, and this is my biggest challenge and my biggest concern, my worry, and it keeps me awake at night, is that the gap is growing. Like my child can't count to 5 yet. He can't count consistently 5 things into a box. His peers in his group are doing multiplications. I know they've got it under control, but I don't know what that looks like. I still don't understand what he's doing when they're all doing mathematics or when they're all writing a paragraph about a story. Or another mom described as that the child himself is concerned and said to her that they all can read and write and I can't. And also the same mom said that I also don't know what I've done and if I've done the right thing, because he could maybe be counting to 10 now if I had him in a special school, he meant. So it's all these dilemmas that parents have. From our talks to the children and our observations, overall the children were very happy. They were moving from one room to the other very easily, and they said they enjoy both places. Their teachers said that yes, they have friends both from mainstream and the resource provision class. Not a very big network of friends, but they do have friends. And we also observed other children that they were showing care to these students. The students themselves said that they are happy, or that when they were discussing about their drawings and photos, they said many positive words about what was happening in these places. Sometimes, we observed instances where, for example, the other children were telling them, oh, put your earphones now on because we're gonna start singing and we know that this is gonna upset you. So things like that they were showing care towards these children. The last area was about the collaboration with the local authority. There we had both positive elements and challenges. One of the improvements was that the schools had a case worker, so they had somebody to collaborate with in the local authority. There were many problems in collaboration, and especially there was confusion as to what children we can support in the school and what children we receive. So there was always concern would be able to maintain, the work we do. Sometimes it's difficult to include children in the resource provision class. Can we expand this to the mainstream class? So definitely more work there that needs to be done with the local authority. And what we discussed during the second, and this is the discussion mainly of the findings and how we can think about the two different models. What do they have to offer? Similarities, differences. I'm sure that most of my colleagues in inclusive education would agree that school aid is closer to what has been envisioned as inclusive education, closer to the right-based approach to the education of students with disabilities, whereas schools B and C are more focused on their needs, on a needs-based approach, and on successful inclusion. We have to do inclusion only if it is successful. That could be a very long discussion. It depends how we think about their education. Definitely we want more inclusion in the mainstream school, and this was something that was was agreed across the three schools, although there are more challenges in schools B and C, and this is what we discussed in the second round of the focus groups. But definitely we don't want little special schools in mainstream schools, so we don't want students to be educated only in resource provision classrooms. There should always be linked with a mainstream school. But in any case, if we think that 10, 20 years ago, these students were in special schools, then even this as a space, separate space in a mainstream school, can provide more inclusion, although it's in between, exclusionary and inclusionary practices. But it's very difficult to decide what is inclusive practice and what it is exclusive practice. So what I've learned from that is that we need definitely to increase our dialogue with the teachers to understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, what are the chances to transform their practices towards more inclusion? It's fine what the international organizations say about inclusive education, the theoretical underpinnings, but what's happening in practice, sometimes it's another story, and we definitely can learn more if we work more closely with the participants. In the next 2-3 slides, I have summarized the transformative elements of the project, which, as I said, we still working with the schools, and it's basically what we said in the second round of the focus groups that we want to improve. There were some common elements, but there were also different elements. So for School A, for example, the challenge was to sustain the model. They were very much, they liked very much the model, but the sustainability could be an issue in the future. They said if we don't have enough staff to support the mainstream teachers, if we receive students that don't know how to support, then that could be a threat to what we're doing so far. To give you an example of elements that they wanted School B and C to transform was, for example, they said, we might have an online common space in which we can upload our planning, and this would improve our collaboration with the mainstream schools. So just ideas of how we can improve our practice. The same for parents. I had long discussions with parents when I returned them the findings, and we discussed about their concerns. I think we concluded that, we can go back to schools and ask them if we are not sure. As mom said, I'm not sure where they're going with my child, then go and ask. Or there was an action for the schools to have strategies to improve parents, the information they pass to the parents. Or little things like parents said that I don't know what to ask from a speech and language therapist. Then that's a job for the schools to inform parents what kind of questions they can ask. And we are putting these questions in our toolkit, so to give examples for parents to improve in this area, their collaboration with the therapists, for example. And finally, for the local authorities, which was a challenging area, again, we thought how we can improve our practice, what we can do better to sustain our communication with the local authority, what are the expectations from the local authority too. And now I'm gonna take this tool and take it back to the local authority and ask for their views. Apparently, I didn't include them from the beginning, and that's a limitation. I think they would have brought their own perspective that would be, very useful for the project. But it's never too late. So these are some of the next steps. That's it. Thank you very much.